appeals to us more like family and what we feel an affinity towards. And at First Baptist, we've seen some growth, and we've seen people who have been coming from those cultural backgrounds and not sure how it plays out in our church community. So the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about our Baptist beliefs, a little bit of heritage that comes from, and why that matters for how we do ministry today. So to start, we shared even the end of Before and After sermon series that there was this church history, both from the apostles to that second generation of believers to our church today, and how we covered those 2,000 years roughly. Well, the church was initially those apostles and the early church, the band of believers, the house church. It began to develop bishops and presbyters and this leadership of overseers and elders. And then, of course, it took on some structure. Now, a lot of the early Christians were Jews, came from a Jewish background, and so they knew the structure of the temple and the synagogues, and that was pretty quickly turned into the leadership and the structure of the early church. By the 3rd century, even though there was a lot of persecution going on and a lot of challenges to the early church, they had figured out some sort of structure. Well, when Constantine became pope, and became emperor, and then also had a vision, and you see this merging of the governing world and Christianity. And he said, enough persecution, and almost on the dime, they turned from persecuting Christians to becoming Christians, and soldiers and others who were even forced to be baptized, to be Christianized. That took on a whole new arena for the early church. Now all of a sudden it was highly structured, and it was sort of synonymous with the Roman Empire. And that lasted for a long time. The only church dissension that came about would be in 1054 is the schism between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And then even another 500 years before you get the Roman or the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther posts the 95 Edicts on the Wittenberg Church doors. Of course, you have John Calvin, you have Wycliffe, you have those who essentially have decided something's wrong with the church. And often it was the case because it was forced upon people. It was so synonymous with government that church dictated and demanded how people lived. We talked about that with Henry VIII, that he persecuted people who opposed what was becoming the Church of England, even though he wanted to ratify the church from the Roman Catholic Church because he wanted to get divorced. And the Roman Catholic Church frowned upon it, and so he said, hey, we're going to do our own thing in England. During that time, there's this Protestant Reformation in Germany, in England, in Europe, and there were these people called Puritans and Separatists. Now, Puritans wanted to purify the church. Initially, Martin Luther would have been a Puritan. He wanted to purify the church of some of its practices that he thought didn't live up to what God had intended. And we know that being the priesthood of all believers, saved by grace through faith, that you don't earn your salvation, you receive it from Jesus by grace. These are some of the things and the behaviors that are happening. Now, amidst this Protestant Reformation, there's this other happening. And it's usually in the undercurrent of the Reformation because it doesn't have a singular person in charge of it. In other words, John Calvin, the leader of the what became Presbyterian, or John Wesley, the leader of the Methodist Church, certainly Martin Luther and the Lutherans. Baptists don't really have that single figure, that person. It's just in pockets where we see some of this, what was separatists. So for example, John Smith in England decided that he wanted to practice what was known as believer's baptism. They were known as Anabaptists, or it translated rebaptizers. So he moved to Holland. He had about 40 with him that were baptized. He baptized himself, and then he baptized them. And it was the pouring out of water in this lake, river, wherever it was. But it was believers' baptism. And that sort of began this story of this early Baptist movement. Now, one of his disciples took the church back to England during this Protestant Reformation. Now we've moved from Henry VIII and his daughter Mary, Bloody Mary, and the persecution of Christians, to Elizabeth, who was much more accepting of these forms. And in this place, this church that Thomas Helwise plants as a Believers Baptizing Church, what is today still known as the First Baptist Church. And that was established in London back in the early 17th century. Well, from there, we also know that persecution was still happening. There was still a Church of England. There was still the Roman Catholic Church. There was still the nuances and this marriage of church and government and this expectation. So even if you wanted to be a separatist, you still paid your dues to the Roman Catholic Church or the Church of England. So that's where you get the Puritans moving, or the Pilgrims wanting to come to the New World. Well, in the New World, some things happen that form our Baptist traditions. One key principle was the Puritans still wanted to purify the church. And this is important to understand, because in England, when they wanted to purify the church, they still wanted church law. They just wanted to change some of those laws that they thought needed to be purified. When that came to the New World, there was some of that still to be pushed upon the people. In fact, one of the basins of the New World, the place that the colonies formed, would be Massachusetts. Salem, Massachusetts, in fact, had different pastors and church groups, and they were still trying to ratify the church but make it a church state. It was so intense that anybody who decided to go against the church would be an outcast, would be judged. One example, the Salem witch trials in 1691, 1692, that people who disagreed or had experiences that didn't seem to consist with the church were actually put to death. Well, one of the people that pushed against this was Roger Williams. Roger Williams believed that the church should be separate from the state, and he was concerned by this. In fact, he was opposing a Congregationalist pastor by the name of John Cotton, who believed that not only were they supposed to implement the church with their new laws, but to maintain that everybody honor those laws. They came in believing that the New World was the new Israel. In fact, John Cotton believed that the Native Americans should be treated like the Amalekites. It was shameful, to say the least, that there was this desire to annihilate whole people groups because this was the New World and this was supposed to be the new Israel. Well, Roger Williams pushed back on that, and of course he was then decided upon that he would not be in Salem, and he was cast out and shipped away. Well, he ended up landing in the Providence area of Rhode Island, and when he got there, one of the things that he established, the first non-church instituted government, that which didn't have to pay back to the church, that was truly separate church and state, that in that new colony there were these practices much like our autonomy of Baptist faith, the autonomy of the individual, the autonomy of the local church. Roger Williams, in fact, believed that they should pay to use and purchase the land from the Native Americans, that they were people who equally deserved God's mercy, that there was a ministering to and with, not in opposition or forcing a religion upon them. That's where many of us in the Baptist faith find our beginnings, and we certainly hold dear to those early principles of faith. Believer's baptism, that a person has a right to choose. We have very simple scriptures that follows. Romans 10:9-10, that if you believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord and confess with your mouth that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. The act of confession, that you have to come to that moment to understand the purpose of salvation. We follow that because of sola scriptura, that Scripture alone is our foundation, that there are many traditions of the church that we hold dear, but Baptist belief would want to go back. And of course, because of the printing press, the Bible was much more available to people. So we hold these things to be very dear to us in our Baptist roots. Believer's baptism, that the foundation of Scripture, that other things can be building upon it, but we always go back to that foundation. And then, of course, the autonomy of the individual in the local church, the power of free will. We don't want to force that belief system on others. Even in congregations today, and in my congregation, it was a voting decision by the congregation to bring me in as pastor. We understand that every week people choose to get up out of their day, come to worship, and that is a privilege and an opportunity for me to preach. Now, we certainly believe that is a command, an expectation of believers, but we don't force it. We don't walk around with the tithes and offerings and saying, how much do you make a year? You need to give 10%. Otherwise you cease to be a member, or we won't let you come. Even our act of communion is Baptist in its nature. We serve one another. It's not a coming forward that somebody stands between you and God. It is an act of sharing the Lord's Supper one to another. That we have leadership. We have people who are elders or deacons, and they were voted into those positions. The congregation said, we trust these people to follow our practices of believers' baptism, a call to conversion. We also ask them to continue to grow in their faith and lead us to do the same, and that they also believe in the Scripture as the foundation of our faith. Those leaders are put in place by that congregation. We'll share more of these principles in weeks to come, but one of the things that was difficult in the onset of our Baptist faith is that because we believed in the autonomy of the local church, as Baptist churches were growing throughout America, they also was growing with dissension and disagreement. Now they knew they needed resources to share together, so they began in the early 18th century associations. One was the association in Philadelphia, and at the early onset there's 13 churches. By the late 18th century, by 1790, there's about 35 associations, almost 500 churches, and presumably an estimate of 60,000 congregates. That's how fast the Baptist churches were growing. But they were also in disagreement. While they came together, because their associations were advisory roles, not authority, they had things that they would disagree about. And they would disagree about missions and where missions should be spent. That was one of the growing unities of the Baptist movement as well, that there was the William Careys, and there were different people who were missionaries and wanting to share the gospel beyond. And these churches shared those resources together, and then, of course, sent the missionaries out. Adoniram Judson left the Congregationalist from the Americas, and he landed in India a Baptist. He interpreted the Scripture. He was writing it. He wanted to create a translation himself. And while he was writing it and translating it, he felt the call and the burden of believers' baptism. It's kind of an interesting story. How do you send word back home and say, hey, those of you that sent me here, I disagree with some of our beliefs. I'm now Baptist. But he was, of course, one of the cornerstones of early Baptist missions. That was one of the practices of the early associations and the unifying pieces of the churches, but they disagreed. They disagreed on other issues. If you get baptized in one church, can you go to another church and that transfer, or do they need to be rebaptized, what was known as landmarkism? It was something that churches decided for themselves, but yet they said the argument, well, if I've been baptized from somewhere else and I move here, I have to get rebaptized? And they would have arguments about this. The biggest argument, slavery. In 1845, the Mission Society said, we can't continue to struggle between the abolitionists of the North and the churches of the South. That's why many people know the difference between what became the Southern Baptist Convention, the churches in the South, and what for a time was known as the Northern Baptist Convention. Eventually that became known as the American Baptist Churches of the United States of America, of USA. Our church, First Baptist Church in Nokomis, is an American Baptist church. We were part of that Northern Baptist Convention, renamed, and we do things a little differently than our Southern Baptist churches around us. The Southern Baptist Convention actually is much larger, but there's still a principle, whether it's National Baptist, General Baptist, Regular Baptist, American Baptist, Southern Baptist, that we understand that there's some basic principles of faith that we want to continue to encourage. And we celebrate these roots at First Baptist.